So what I want to do is kind of is really just show you that actually how the phenomenon is wiring the brain. So while we're experiencing this thing as being scary, confusing, and complicated, because that's our shared experience of it actually, both those of us who actually are in the experience and those of you who are observing us in our extreme states find this scary, confusing, and complicated. And for me, that's actually just the kind of dressing. That's the outward expression of what we're experiencing. What's going on under the hood is that this phenomenon is wiring the brain. You'll remember that our process, you've seen it many times. Of course, what's happening is, as we are exposed to this phenomenon, our brain is adjusting to it as the source of stimuli. We're recognizing the presence and absence. The phenomenon itself is changing, sometimes being more invasive, so more aggressive about how it's inserting information or how it's engaging our processor. It's presenting all this variety that gets our attention. These three together are preparing the brain to receive content. And of course, that's the piece that we can't ignore. The brain is doing this just in response to this constant stream of unusual stimuli. Then there's the phenomenology itself, which has these, I'm going to talk just here about sort of two characteristics. The one is the mode, which I'm describing as, for the majority of us, is this interaction between what voices say, represented by the speech bubble here, and what I think, where these are in the same bandwidth. And of course, this is where this jack in the box is inserting itself in the aware mind, and bringing my sort of attention to my thinking. So this is brain, this is phenomenology. And the second piece that I want to refer to here is the style, or what we typically read as intent. So my voices, for example, are cruel and aggressive and torturing and threatening, with some loving voices in the background. That's the conflicting kind of idea. But generally, as I say, the style is malign and threatening. And then, of course, there's the content that they present, which you've seen has structure to the stories that, as I say, trap us in this kind of situation where our emotions are being engaged, our emotional systems are being engaged, because the stimuli that are presented are typically out of context or in conflict with what I'm trying to do in my day, in my life. And of course, this is, so my gates in my processor are flagging these stimuli and actually saying, don't like this. And of course, that's what's engaging my emotional systems. And of course, what's happening here is, ordinarily in the real world, what I would do is I would, if I was, receiving a constant stream of unpleasant inputs, I would walk away. And of course, if, the individual who was throwing these insults at me kept following me around, I would do something about it. I would either pick up a baseball bat or call the police, whichever sort of made sense at the time. But of course, what's happening here with these stimuli is that they're arriving in the aware mind, independent of your environment. So what's happening is they're bypassing our filters. And so what that's doing is engaging our threat system typically, because either our soothe system is saying, I don't like this, or our threat system, is kind of saying, literally, this is a threat. It's a threat, to me. This one's saying it's a threat to my quality of life. But I'm left with no option but to process it in some way, because I can't actually walk away from it. I can't verify it. I can't change it. The stimulus itself. So of course, what happens is that it leads me towards interpreting it in some way. And of course, I'm using this my story model to talk about how we interpret. And of course, what's happening is each comment that voices make is engaging a frame of reference, in my story, or engaging a new frame of reference in an otherworldly space, that's asserting a relationship with me and my story. So, through that indirect route, of this power relationship, is affecting how this transactional process is updating all of my frames of reference. So the beliefs that I derive from this, and of course the beliefs are things that I am deriving because precisely because this is in a space filled with unknowns and uncertainties. And of course, the mind doesn't like uncertainty. So what I do is I form beliefs about it. Some of those beliefs are the things that I interpret from the way that I experience the phenomenon. So early on, I heard two people talking about what I was doing, and I reached the conclusion that it was the neighbors. Later on, voices themselves, so the phenomenon itself, introduced the idea of ancestors. And of course, I had some voices then saying, I love you. And of course, what this did was really introduce this idea of the two teams in conflict with each other. And then as I voices asserted all these things about being God, the devil, an evil God, a big man, actors in a conspiracy theory, all those things we saw in the story and story structure, and also, of course, aliens, as I mentioned, and a bunch of others. I mean, there's a whole string of them, but these, I say, are the very common ones. And of course, the thing that they share is this idea of conflict, is that there are two characters typically, or two teams, or two conflicting ideas, even though the names might sound nice. I met a woman at one of the training conferences that I actually went to who heard the voice of wisdom and the voice of reason. And of course, all it was, was these two voices doing this, playing, good cop, bad cop, policing her thoughts. They just, had described themselves as as having those names, which sound quite reasonable, or sound like the kind of thing you might want to interact with. When it's in your mind, you don't want to. And of course, all they were doing was inserting these two conflicting ideas and putting her in the middle of sorting them out. So this is what's engaging us with conflict, is the interaction with voices where they have used this quirk of the phenomenology that makes us experience it as something other than myself, therefore, and of course, independent of the environment, and therefore, of course, I form beliefs about it. And of course, the overall effect of this is that it's what this is doing, the phenomenology itself, is it's actually, plus of course, voices policing my thoughts, they're commenting on it, commenting on my every thought. It brings thoughts into focus. And then these two-faced characters bring conflict, by introducing, either the ideas that conflict with me and what I want to do. For me, their mere presence is a conflict of my life. I don't need them in my life. They bring absolutely no value to me. They're a clear knock to my quality of life. Or they're actually, as I say, introducing conflict, either kind of conflicting ideas that they're presenting and putting you in the middle of. As I say, they kind of introduce the idea of ancestors and then promptly made them victims, in this kind of, in the stories that they're told. So that's why I say two-faced. I'm saying this deliberately, is that actually voices can claim to be anything, and and whichever mode they adopted, whether it was even aliens. For me, when they introduced the idea of aliens, there were good aliens and bad aliens. One was a forward party designed to kind of introduce religion and suppress us, so that when the other party came along later, thousands of years later, apparently, we would be, subdued. That was kind of the story. And then, of course, because I'm hearing voices that say I love you, then there are other good aliens involved. And of course, this is all at the time whilst new Star Wars movies are being made. So it's in the news, at least in some small way. And of course, in the same way that voices were engaged in a conspiracy thought story, the conspiracy the players in the conspiracy just shifted to good guys, bad guys, and aliens. And that's all I'm representing with the two colors of the face. Of course, the religion thing was good cop, bad cop. This guy is the devil is God's best buddy. His creation, God needs evil, apparently. I disagree. Evil causes suffering. There is no way you can justify that. So even the first two voices I heard, male, female voice, very active, male voice in the background, one more interested, one less interested, different ideas. And then, of course, in terms of not just ancestors, but anybody who had died, of course, could be brought into the picture. And of course, it could be somebody that I didn't know that just decided they didn't like me. Of course, and that, of course, was how they then set that off against, say, my grandmother or my father or whoever. And all they're doing is actually setting up those two things. And of course, what that's doing is it's stealing mind share. And of course, you know, I'm going to keep it at that point and kind of say that actually it's occupying the mind, and because the mind is busy, and of course this is prodding us and calling up frames of reference, we are contaminating all our frames of reference. You know, even if we think this is you know, some of us, you know, are determined to say that this is actually a good experience. As I say, I object to it as on a matter of ethics, that actually, if it's stealing mind share, it is setting your priorities for you. So it's choosing what you think about. And for me, you know, I object to that very strongly. So it's on the pure basis that it steals mind share. It's uninvited. I say it is completely unethical. It's not transparent. There is no way, you know, that you can actually justify this thing as having any benefit to any person or to us as humanity. So of course, what's happening here is that because thoughts have come, you know, into focus, and voices are commenting on my thinking, I'm getting these millions and millions of transactions at the level of thought, at some distorted signal strength, usually an exaggerated one, where I'm weighting signals differently than my ordinary world stimuli would normally value them, if you like. This is giving me false values to signal strengths of stimuli, not just from voices, but because they're commenting on what I'm doing and what I'm thinking about. They're also distorting my normal day-to-day signals, stimuli. Okay. This stuff, of course, is the beliefs that are intensifying the experience of it, and that of course is what's leading to the exaggerated emotions, and of course the extreme states. And I talk about exaggerated emotions in all kinds of ways. So, say for me, there were certain themes that I became sensitive to. I described, for example, my technology, which was a theme that voices pestered me sort of all the way through. You know, I became very sensitive to that. Voices made a huge, big issue, you know, of the fact that I had information that was important, that may be the most important man on the planet. And of course, there was at some point when you know, voices were making threats that this conspiracy, this information would be stolen or abused. I put in a lot of extra effort to protecting that information, to sharing it with others before it was ready to share. You know, there were all sorts of, you know, sort of consequences, you know, of those sort of exaggerated emotions, things that I became sensitive to, that were actually not productive, of course, in my life. And then, of course, sometimes those exaggerated emotions can actually endure for quite some time and become what I would call, you know, what we call extreme states. So paranoia, for example, that endures for weeks, you know, would be a good example. And of course, what this is doing is this has changed your priorities, and you're getting exaggerated emotions associated with that. Of course, this is the stuff that's shunting you off track. It's displacing my story, my real story, the one I live in this world, in our shared world. And of course, those two together, I'm using this as a multiplication sign here. Transaction volume, that is plus significance, which is the signal strength, plus you know, emotions associated with it, are the things that are wiring the brain. So this is the neuroplastic harm, you know, that is happening, I say, right at the story level, and even right down to the detail level. So, you know, my voices kind of badgered me, not just, you know, about technology, but for example, about my phone. So my mobile phone became, you know, a tool for work. It became, you know, a tool for social activity, of course, what have you, Facebook, calling friends, calling family. It also became a tool for the CIA to be following me. And so it became a threat as well. And, you know, not many people see their phone as a threat, but those are associations with exaggerated emotions that became attached to this object called a phone in my brain, in terms of how this thing is actually stored, so that when voices are making a threat, you know, about a conspiracy, you know, and they manage to connect something I'm doing with my phone to it, that information has been stored in my brain, and it's in my history over here. And of course, one comment is actually bringing that up into my aware mind, and of course, therefore, is influencing, you know, how I process that information. And of course, this is the real harm up here, and unfortunately, it's lost in the fact that what this process is doing is driving, because we can't go back and verify where this is coming from, because it has no provenance, because we don't know what it is, and we're forming beliefs about it. this stuff is all, this stuff is all pushing the process forwards, and we are actually interpreting it, and we're giving it meaning. Okay, and of course, some groups actually, of course, in the Hearing Voices movement, favor the idea of finding meaning in voices, and of course, I'll show you later on that if you decide to find meaning, if you look for it, you will find it, because that's actually how beliefs work. If you believe there's meaning, you will find meaning. It's that straightforward, and I'll show you the difference between finding meaning and making sense of later on. So, of course, what we're going to do is focus up here and recognize that this down here, the way we're talking about what this means, or the way we're actually interpreting it, this is the stuff, that's what others are seeing, as oversensitivity, as irrational behavior, and of course, when it's extreme, that's paranoia, panic attacks, long bouts of mania. Of course, you don't give meaning to those things. Those are a complete distraction, from getting on with life. So the language around how we talk about giving meaning is actually not particularly helpful either. And that's why I actually want to talk about the idea, as I say, of making sense of it. Because actually, even if you have sort of past trauma and you can make sense of the experience of hearing voices as being a similar pattern of being bullied or abused, as happened to you in the past, it doesn't mean actually, that doesn't translate to voices, for example, actually having meaning. What it translates to is them actually exaggerating your emotions associated with that experience of having an aggressive relationship with a voice claiming to be your abuser. And so that's just really the difference, I'd say, between making sense of and giving meaning to. So I'm going to introduce the idea here to say that actually, of course, all of that is, as I mentioned, it's scary, confusing, and complicated. In fact, let me go back here. The confusion here is here. We don't know what to believe, of course, because this is why we have so many beliefs that keep popping up as a result of this thing that won't go away. So the phenomenon is inserting information that's provoking the mind. And of course, that's leading to interpretations, assessment of implications. Some of those become beliefs. And of course, this is the confusing piece. So these two together are scary and confusing. This piece becomes very, very complicated because what's happening is each of us is updating our own frames of reference in a very individual way because it's connected to what we're doing, the context that we're in, and what have you. Whereas up here, we can actually radically simplify it. There aren't that many variations on the mode of phenomenology. We can actually recognize how the brain is adjusting to it. We can actually recognize that there is structure to the stories of the content. And we can actually recognize that, that we can map the beliefs, as I've shown you in two other experience videos. So we can simplify some of that complication by recognizing actually that the emotions we feel about this, even though they're very, very complex, if we think about them actually in terms of our emotional systems, we can start to simplify it, number one. And number two, we can also recognize actually that our emotions are also predictive. We don't really think of them that way. But when you connect emotion and information, it becomes much, much easier to actually see that. So, of course, because our processor, as we process information, that's predictive, going from stimulus heading towards sort of, towards outcome, or starting from outcome and trying to verify stimuli. There is, it does have a direction to it. And of course, our systems are shaping literally the information that's available in the brain. So of course, that leads our train of thought, which then of course shapes, what we're thinking about, and of course the outcomes that we see, and therefore the actions that we take. So we know this, for example, most obviously from if our threat system is engaged, which is part of our monitoring system. If it's so severely engaged that we perceive a physical threat, then we have a physical reaction in the body that prepares us for action. And the options we see, literally the only options that we can see at the time, because you've had this frontal lobotomy, the system here is shut down. This one rather is shut down. all we can, all we're looking for is how can we get away from this thing? And if we can't get away, how on earth can we fight it? And actually, if neither of those options is available, what happens is that, is we freeze. So what's happening, of course, is when the phenomenology is introduced, or this phenomenon is introducing new stimuli with this kind of surprise element that I'm representing by the jack in the box. What it's doing is pulling us out of our comfort zone and actually presenting a threat to us. And of course, what happens is, we can't run away from it. I'm saying we can't run. Some of us think we can't fight, and we certainly can't fight physically. So of course, what happens is we freeze. And of course, this is why extreme states endure. So ordinarily, in the sort of ordinary environmental world, if we perceive an environmental threat, we're able to move away. And the moment we move away, the threat subsides, and of course, we breathe a sigh of relief, and we actually see the world, sort of around us again. And then we kind of recognize that actually that we can review this kind of almost in a freeze frame mode. And that's just actually, how our brain is really adjusting, and it's changing the kind of information that it presents to the aware mind. So normally what's happening for us is we're bouncing around between these two systems. We're trying to achieve good outcomes, and of course we're doing something to get there. So of course what we're trying to do is actually love life, laughing out loud. That's just my phrase for kind of saying how we feel when all our systems are actually in equilibrium. And of course this is what leads to optimism. And of course as we kind of see a good future, of course we're happy to sort of build and invest. So we're happy to invest time and effort in achieving more of this stuff, basically. And of course that's our normal sort of comfort zone. And of course as this phenomenology shunts us down towards our kind of threat system, of course what we're inclined to do, the kind of frame of mind that leads to is, if we're way down here, what we'll do is we will act to make ourselves secure. If we're sort of up in the drive system, it'll drag us down here. So instead of building and investing, we'll actually shift our attention towards maintaining what we have. And the same thing over here in the Sue system, if actually we're not able to kind of enjoy, the situation that we're actually in, particularly on a regular basis, what we'll do is we'll shift towards protecting what we have. And I think you'll see, all of these kind of shifts in the behavior of people like myself who kind of hear voices. I've done an awful lot, or I've wasted an awful lot of effort, for example, as I mentioned before, protecting the special information that I had, of course, that voices were making a big thing of. I wasted a lot of effort, putting an extra antivirus system on my PC and exploring every little glitch, which actually was more a problem of bad error messages than actual real problems. A whole lot of wasted effort, but because I felt this sort of milder threat, if you like, up here, I put a lot of effort into maintaining and to protecting instead of into enjoying and building and investing. So key point here, what I want to do is to kind of say is that actually our emotional systems literally shape the information that's accessible to the aware mind. And what's accessible to the aware mind, of course, is what shapes the response. And of course, the response is what leads to outcomes. So rather than trying to understand, our individual kind of emotions, because this is happening at the speed of thought, I'll show you later on in the mind strategies that what you do is you actually target, each of the emotional systems and make sure that you're satisfying the systems. And you can do this by understanding the kinds of behaviors that they lead us towards, or the kinds of outcomes, if you like, and principles that actually satisfy the symptoms. And I say, of course, we can't run away, from this phenomenon. So, flight is actually not an option. We think that fighting is not an option, and I think this actually is probably a sort of fairly personal response kind of thing. So some of us actually feel that this thing, because it comes along and asserts, all this dominance and aggressive and asserts a power relationship over us, and frightens us and threatens us and actually imposes consequences. You know, so if you've got the devil pestering you all day, just bleeping with your mind all day, of course, that is very, very scary. And of course, making threats, fighting it doesn't necessarily seem that easy to do. And of course, what happens is we freeze, and of course, what happens then is it leads to us appeasing voices. And what I'll show you later on actually is that actually we can fight, and this is the whole idea behind the mind strategies. And not only can we fight, we can actually do things to prevent being shunted down there in the first place. And we can actually make sure that we have a plan in the mind so that it is accessible when we get down into this kind of frightened sort of stage over here. And we can also recognize that actually fighting comes typically from being cornered or from being angry and angered. And actually we can put that to good use, because it's a very good way to bring us up here and help us actually see more information. So the takeaway from that is that actually we can simplify how we view emotions by looking at our emotional systems, number one. Number two is that actually our emotions lead how our mind processor is processing information. So if our threat system is engaged, then we will see threats. Our processing will be focused on fight or flight. So of course, generally we're not operating down here, we're operating up here. So if voices are shunting you down here, then it's the threat system that is actually wiring the brain. And of course, this is the piece that we need to recognize. If we're feeling threatened all the time, it knocks your confidence in yourself. It knocks your confidence in terms of what you're actually doing. It knocks your confidence in how you can actually realize opportunities. So this is the importance of it, is to recognize actually that if this is being engaged too often, it's actually limiting our view of the world.